You're watching Press TV World News. Time now for the news review. Prospects of reconciliation between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine remain bleak following bilateral talks in Geneva. The U.S. is now threatening Russia with a swift response if it invades Ukraine. Senior U.S. diplomat Victoria Nuland says that the U.S. plans to inflict very sharp pain on Russia should it attack Ukraine. She says that the U.S. has prepared 18 scenarios in the event of a Russian attack on Ukraine. She says, however, Washington is still open to dialogue with Moscow and intends to respond to its demand for security guarantees. On the other side, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says Moscow and Washington are on totally different tracks. He says this is disturbing for Russia. The remarks follow meetings between Russian officials and the U.S. and NATO earlier this week. The West accuses Russia of planning to attack Ukraine. Moscow rejects the allegation outright. Now, inviting a couple of guests now to get some more insight on this. Jerome Hughes, our correspondent in Brussels, is joining us. Also, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author in London. Good to see you both, gentlemen. Now, let's go to Brussels first. Jerome, diplomacy has apparently failed. The two sides are, keeping up their harsh rhetoric, as you know. So, given the fact that they're very far from reaching an agreement, so how seriously should we take the threat of a new conflict erupting in Europe?
Well, Behrooz, it's difficult to say. Diplomacy has failed so far, but certainly we haven't reached the end game yet. And, just in the past half an hour, I was speaking to one of my contacts in the European Commission, a senior official there. And the European Commission, its job is to formulate policy in terms of building up sort of a sanctions package, a potential new sanctions package that would be applied against Moscow. And they're coordinating closely with London and also Washington to try and build up this potential package of sanctions. And what I'm told is that, in the event that Russia invades Ukraine, which of course Moscow denies that's the intention, well then these sanctions would be applied, and apparently they would be the strongest sort of sanctions package that have ever been put together. They would be sort of targeting sort of all aspects of Russian society, Russian citizens living abroad, and the idea would be, apart from a financial impact on Vladimir Putin, that it would have a political impact on him. But really, what I'm also told is that what's most likely to happen at this stage is that the West is going to give assurances to the Kremlin to say, look, there are no immediate plans for Ukraine to join NATO. We'll scale back our military operations close to your borders and on the Black Sea, and to just give concrete assurances to Vladimir Putin that, this is going to de-escalate from the Western side. Because really the feeling is that there's no military option here. I mean, if you leave the nuclear weapons aside, even on a conventional war footing, Russia has an enormous military capabilities. It has a fantastic defense system right along its borders in terms of anti-missile system. It has a huge number of troops. It has state-of-the-art equipment. And so even the feeling is that NATO officials feel that there's not even really a conventional war option with Russia, apart from the fact that it has this huge arsenal. Again, of course, always in the background is the possibility of it escalating to nuclear, which would, of course, be catastrophic. So really the only show in town here, Behrooz, according to the people I've been speaking to, is a situation of diplomacy and to try and scale things back. And of course, they will be asking for Russia to try and give something in return. The elephant in the room, of course, is Crimea. I mean, I was speaking to one analyst recently, and he said, look, perhaps if you're going to criticize Vladimir Putin and his government, you could say that maybe they rushed into Crimea a bit too quickly, because the 2014 referendum, there was the overwhelming majority of the people of Crimea wanted to rejoin the Russian Federation. So perhaps he should have played the long game with that. That's a game he would have won in the long term. Perhaps he did that too quickly, perhaps without coordinating better with Kiev and with Brussels and with Washington and so on. And that continues to be sort of a major bone of contention, and it's sort of the backdrop to all of this.
All right. Okay, now let me ask Marcus this. Marcus, one basic argument that Russia is making is that NATO promised to stop enlarging beyond this, what is called Cold War area. But then those promises were broken, as you know. And NATO is arguing that its decision made by consensus, not by promises made by individual member states, alluding to the United States, do not count as the alliance's formal policy. So which side do you believe is giving a more plausible argument?
There are two words which account for the dangerous level of global tension today between America and Russia: NATO expansion. And there are two words which account for NATO expansion: American exceptionalism. It is indeed the case, the irrefutable case, that in 1990, the Soviet Union consented to German reunification on the grounds that NATO would not expand beyond Germany's eastern border, namely into Eastern Europe. That was an assurance, albeit a verbal one, which was given to the then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev by George Bush Sr., Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand, and also the then American Secretary of State, James Baker, who told Gorbachev that there will not be 1 inch eastwards of NATO expansion. But, alas, the Americans violated that oral assurance which was given to Mikhail Gorbachev, and that is why NATO expanded not just into Eastern Europe, but also into the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So Russia has a legitimate grievance, but time is not on the side of the Russians, because whilst American policymakers are saying that they are prepared to keep on discussing the crisis surrounding Ukraine with the Kremlin, at the same time, the Americans are arming to the teeth the Ukrainian armed forces. They are expanding NATO's presence in Eastern Europe and also in the Baltic states. The Americans are widening their naval presence in the Black Sea. And on top of that, Washington is encouraging Sweden and Finland to join NATO. So you see, the Americans are demonstrating their specialism in duplicity. In public, they are calling for further dialogue with Russia, but at the same time, they are going to extreme lengths to undermine and threaten Russian national security. So what are Russia's options? Well, it is possible that Russia could take military action of some kind in Ukraine to counter the very dangerous presence, the very dangerous menace emanating from the country against Russian national security. At the same time, the Russians could deploy military personnel and hardware to Cuba and Venezuela. Indeed, in my new book, Arise Rossiya, which was published about a year ago, I predicted that the Kremlin would deploy or would consider deploying its armed forces to both Cuba and Venezuela as a bargaining chip to be used against the Americans in relation to the American military presence in Eastern Europe. And whilst NATO on paper is a collective decision-making bloc, in practice, America is the de facto leader. Right. When America wants something, NATO does it. Because quite simply, the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Greeks, the Spanish are very concerned about NATO's presence in Ukraine. And they do not wish to see Ukraine admitted into the Western military bloc. So all is not well in NATO.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry to jump in. That's all the time we have. Thank you very much. Jerome Hughes, our correspondent in Brussels, and Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author in London. And that's it for this edition of the News Review.